Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming online and in person. Today we have a talk which is prepared on very short notice. Thank you so much, Johanna, by Johanna Sopanen, who is a PhD student at the University of Exeter in philosophy, working on the gut microbiome and mental health in relation to psilocybin in particular. But she has previously done, she has a BSc in psychology and then went on to do an MA in religious studies, both at the University of Groningen. And now she's working on this PhD project. This MA dissertation was on Jung's work, and that is what she's presenting on now. Thank you very much, Johanna, for coming. Looking forward very much to hearing your talk. Sure.
Okay, so yeah, well, very nice that you all came around to see this presentation. So this is the same presentation that I've, oh, holy shit. Oh,
it's finished.
this is Groningen represent. This is one of my, we haven't seen each other in a couple of years, and Tina has now decided to join us. So nice to see you again. We did our undergraduate together. Well, okay, awesome. So I have given this presentation at the Exeter conference last April, and then it's in Finnish also because I did give it at a Finnish psychedelic conference also last November. And I couldn't edit the slides anymore because my Prezi account had expired. So there's also some, I would have maybe changed around some things, but we'll just have to go with whatever it is now. So a little bit about the Red Book and how I came around to it was actually during my master's, I wanted to do something on psychedelics, particularly about, okay, so now somebody's waiting. How can, oh yeah, there. But as my advisor was a specialist in Gnosticism, and then we had Jung as a mutual interest, then we were sort of thinking, okay, let's do something around Jung's work, and then they formed a collaboration with this Argentinian psychologist who actually translated the Red Book from German to Spanish, and I spent some months in Buenos Aires at a Jungian institute and worked with him then together on that. So yeah, just out of curiosity, how many people have heard of the Red Book or read anything of the Red Book? Or okay, few, yeah. In case, I'm actually gonna give this around, like if you just wanna take a look about sort of the language and to see what it's about. This is a reader's copy, so the original is with these very impressive images, which you will also see along in the presentation. So okay, oh, there you go. Oh shit, okay, I need to go a little bit back now. Okay, so for briefly, just for those of you who have not heard of Carl Gustav Jung, maybe a small introduction. So a Swiss psychoanalyst born in 1875 in Switzerland. He grew up influenced very much by Christianity. His father was a pastor, and he also had multiple uncles who were big ministers, and it was something that he always struggled with because he found this Christianity as very dogmatic and restricted, but it's something that he definitely carried over to his works, and his works are very influenced by religious thought as a general, especially Gnosticism and alchemy, to which he later then delved into. So probably many of you have heard of these notions such as shadow, archetypes, collective unconscious, anima and animus. These are all Jung's ideas, but they weren't really something that he created. Rather, he brought them forward. It's really windy here for those who are on Zoom, in case you can hear it. And yeah, he's one of the founders of analytical psychology, but in many ways, like many people remember him from the associations with Freud, but they actually came from very different intellectual traditions. And although they were influenced by one another, I think Jung is very significantly different from Freud. And yeah, so Jung is said to have interpreted some 80,000 dreams in his lifetime. So he had this very empirical, analytical approach to the unconscious, and he really believed that the unconscious was something that we just had not yet managed to uncover, but that we had tools essentially to go forth to understand it better through our experiences with dreams and intuitions, etc. And Jung is also very influential in the study of esotericism, which is actually what I did my my master's in Gnosticism, esotericism, and mysticism. Many of these ideas from esoteric traditions are also something that are intertwined in his works. And in that sense, Jung also shares a lot with these figures such as William Blake and Dante and Swedenborg and Jacob Boehme, as in that he brought forward something that wasn't quite, you know, it wasn't just about psychology, but it contributed to certain kind of mystical tradition. So to understand a little bit about the Red Book, we have to go back to the early years of Jung's career as a psychiatrist. So the Red Book, I think it's good to mention at this point that it was something that only became available for public in 2009. So Jung actually never intended it to be published. And that's why it's such a considerable body of work, because it's like, what is this massive opus that is so extremely different from everything else that Jung wrote before, and why did he not want to have it published? And you know, how can we use this to understand Jung's other works in this moment? So basically, in the early 20th century, psychoanalysis was just in the early formations. This was the time when spiritualism was also spreading across Europe and America, and Jung was among these medical professionals who were also working with mediums and you know, understanding this kind of parapsychological phenomena. And then he moved on to work with Eugene Bleuler at the Bergholzi Hospital. This is the same person who actually later coined the term schizophrenia, which was then known as dementia precox. So Jung worked a lot with schizophrenic patients as well. So overall, you know, Jung became quite established in the early parts of his career. He has also married one of the wealthiest women in Switzerland, so he was enjoying quite some prosperity, and you know, probably didn't have to wash his own laundry or anything. So in 1906, he met with Sigmund Freud, and then these two began this intensive collaboration, which lasted for many years, of which, sorry, I have to admit some people here again. Of which many people are, you know, have written about and all that. And then there started to be a certain kind of separation, or maybe these ideas were always something that were different. Can I mute myself? No. Okay. Well, so basically, Jung's ideas about what the unconscious was started to be more in the realm of this fantasy and mythology, and this was something that Freud also had an interest in, but he, for certain reasons, did not decide to go down that path, mainly because I think he felt that the reputation of psychoanalysis would be compromised if there was just too deep dives into the occult and all that. But so in 1912, with the publication of the Psychology of the Unconscious, a study of the transformations and symbolism of the libido, Jung then declared, this idea of the collective unconscious. So he didn't call it yet than that, but basically this fantasy realm that exists within each person, that is shared and not necessarily just particularly for the individual. And then after that, they had some, very feisty letters exchanged between them, and then the correspondence ended. And I think this was quite difficult time for Jung, and this was also around the time when his mental health started to be a little bit compromised, and he became tormented by visions and dreams that he could not understand. And according to his own accounts, these visions and dreams were extremely disturbing for his daily life. They were something that he really had a hard time with. And one of the most famous visions that he had happened on a train journey to Schaffhausen in 1913, in which he saw Europe drowning in blood. And then he thought, okay, well, I probably have lost plot here, that this is like, whatever is going on is something that is, hazardous, and, that he as a psychiatrist saw himself as being somehow ill. But so then World War I broke out in August 1913, and 1914, sorry, and he realized that actually his dreams had certain precognitive quality, and he felt that actually this unconscious material which had been coming up was something that he needed to attend to. So this is when he started with this process of confronting the unconscious, and started to really work with it using this technique called active imagination, which is essentially he incorporated the things that he had probably learned while working with the mediums, as well as, well, he probably didn't, I don't know how much he incorporated of working with the schizophrenic patients, but he always suspected that there was maybe something to the particular visions and hallucinations that could actually be of great value. So he began to work with these trance states and writing down everything into these black leather notebooks called black books, which actually came available for publication only last year as well. It is essentially Jung's quest to find his soul, which he feels had gone missing, as there was this prevailing strict scientific environment in which he felt like he couldn't really grow and work in ways that he wanted to. So the Liber Novus, meaning the new book, begins with this: my soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak, I call you. Are you there? I have returned and here again. I have shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I have come to you. I am with you after long years of wandering. I have come to you again. So, yeah, I mean, and this is interestingly also something that reflected not just maybe Jung's personal experiences, but also the current climate at the time, because obviously it was, the psychology was still very much developing, but it was, becoming increasingly dogmatized in the sense that it was relying on these statistical methodologies, which Jung felt that were inherently limiting. And he writes in Aeon later on that there was this kind of split that happened, that faith lacked experience and science missed out soul. So also something, about the Red Book is that obviously it has this very particular vivid images which Jung then painted that represent these visionary experiences that he had. And a big part of it was him just struggling to actually surrender to the experience in the way that these visions could be brought forward in an appropriate way. And actually him as a scholar and as an intellectual have to just completely abandon his pre-existing knowledge to allow these more visionary qualities to come forth. And like here, this is like an exchange that Jung has with his soul, where he says that I know of no other world, and then the soul answers like, should it not exist because you know nothing of it. So yeah, like I already mentioned before, this the Red Book speaks about this different distinction between the spirit of the depths and the spirit of the times. And Jung felt that the spirit of the times was something that was essentially pushing him towards this direction, where there was this further split of the psyche of this overly rational man that had no connection to nature or to any kind of divinity or to his own soul, and that actually the spirit of the depths, which according to Jung's understanding was something that understood more of this archaic collective human experience, was like further luring him into this madness. And yeah, here he writes that he robbed me of speech and writing for everything that was not in his service, namely the melding together of sense and nonsense, which produces the supreme meaning. So, and yeah, I think what is very important to say also in this, at this point, is that so much of the Red Book is like really densely mythological and historical. There's these characters, some of them, you know, being mythological characters, some of them being historical, that with which Jung is constantly engaging with. So he's really using his vast knowledge, or like, I don't know if he's using it, but it's coming forward in this narrative of the Red Book. Yeah, it's a really beautiful book. You know, it's very, you know, it's he wrote it down with German and Latin calligraphy. It took enormous amounts of time and care. So it's very mysterious that he didn't want it published. He actually worked on it on and off for some 16 years overall. Let's come back some more. So yeah, here is this soul speaking to Jung again, saying like, be silent and listen. Have you recognized your madness, and do you admit it? Have you noticed that all your foundations are completely immersed in madness? Do you not want to recognize your madness and welcome it in a friendly manner? You wanted to accept everything, so accept madness too. Let the light of your madness shine, and it will suddenly dawn on you. Madness is not to be despised and not to be feared, but instead you should give it life. So regarding the later importance of the Red Book, Jung himself referred these years of writing it as the most important time of his life, and actually as the foundation of everything that he further elaborated on. So he felt that his most important ideas came to him during this time. And also it's interesting because some of these mythological characters and figures actually stayed with Jung. And in this image, for instance, you have Philemon, who comes to Jung in one of the stories. He's this scenic old man figure who comes to Jung carrying a bunch of keys. And this Philemon became sort of a guide to Jung, and he would also, his followers would later say, you know, years later, that Jung would just take walks in his garden and have discussions with Philemon. So then it's just now, after knowing about these experiences that Jung went through, it's interesting to consider, like, well, how did he actually go on about building his psychology after that? You know, he himself also, you know, regards it that it is kind of ironic that he, as a psychiatrist, would run into the same material found in the that is the stuff of psychosis and found in the insane, but he saw that this was actually the same kind of area, the same, what he calls the matrix of mythopoetic imagination that had vanished from the rational age. And this was also something that he saw as being very fundamental for building this new psychology, to bring forth again this archaic modality of perceiving and being in the world. So Jung went on to elaborate on the structure of the unconscious, and especially he wrote a lot about the relationship of the ego and the collective unconscious, and archetypes which he felt cohabited this space of the unconscious, and that were activated in these experiences of or encounters with the unconscious. But it's very interesting how Jung actually defines the unconscious, and here I've highlighted this one particular part because, well, he says about the unconscious that you trust your unconscious as if it were a loving father, but it is nature and cannot be made use of as if it were a reliable human being. And also he says that nature is incomparable guide if you know how to follow her. So he actually makes this parallel between the unconscious and nature, this work that we were also discussing here a couple of weeks ago, that is very hard to pin down. Then here's another bit that is quite important, that if you follow the river, you surely come to the sea finally, but if you take it literally, you soon get stuck in an impossible gorge and you complain of being misguided. So this is one of the first times that Jung started to warn against these literal interpretations, and mainly because he felt that his own experiences were so utterly bizarre that if other people were going through these experiences and taking them literally, that would just lead directly into psychosis. But for instance, like later, some people have regarded Jung as, being kind of like a cult figure or something, that they are saying that he was just trying to implement his own religious worldview, which is easy to understand. This was also before the Red Book was published. And, if you read the Red Book, Jung has his own experiences of being crucified on the cross and, being so immersed into this Christ consciousness and talking all about these kinds of things that are very, very symbolic and very hard to understand. But the key point being that they were symbolic experiences and not something that he was understanding as being literal per se. So in 1916, Jung also published this, actually he didn't publish it, it was written in 1916, but it was unpublished. And in this essay, Jung calls this action which happens the transcendent function, which implies that it certainly had some kind of sacred or divine quality. And he argues that, in order for the personality to grow, the unconscious contents must be prompted into consciousness, and that to be a fully actualized person, there needs to be this collaboration between the unconscious and consciousness. However, there were dangers because the unconscious could also flood the conscious mind if the conscious personality was not prepared for the encounter. And it's interesting because this is the same year also, 1916, when Jung actually published something called the 7 Sermons of the Dead, which is this Gnostic text. So at that time, Jung felt that the Gnostics were actually, he writes that they were his only friends, because he felt that only these people would understand the kind of bizarre experiences that he was undergoing. So then we come to this, like, how does this whole notion of the Red Book and everything fits into the psychedelic paradigm? Well, first of all, you can find many quotations and all that saying that Jung did not endorse psychedelics, and he didn't. He was actually very against them, and he was offered mescaline, did not want it. Basically, he doesn't necessarily have anything to do with psychedelics, but I don't think it's a reason for why we couldn't talk about his theories of altered states of consciousness, because it's a really comprehensive understanding that he has without it. So we basically, Jung wrote a bunch of forewords for these Eastern texts, which were arriving to Europe and America, at the end of the 20th century. And one of the forewords that he wrote was for the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And in this foreword, Jung argues, for instance, that the soul is assuredly not small, but the radiant Godhead itself. The West finds this statement either very dangerous, if not downright blasphemous, or else accepts it unthinkingly and then suffers from a theosophical inflation. So Jung was definitely kind of warning against the Westerners being too enthusiastic and in adopting these ideas that were coming from a culture that was so different than ours. But he clearly understood also that, for instance, Tibetan Book of the Dead, it wasn't just a funerary rite, it was actually a psychological experience of death and rebirth, that it represented this realm of spirits. So what's interesting is that based on this book, the Tibetan Book of the Dead was written one of these most famous psychedelic manuals ever, the Psychedelic Experience by Leary, Metzner, and Albert. And this is still one of the foundational texts for psychedelic experience, because this for this understanding of ego loss comes from. And basically in the foreword to this book, Leary, etc., they completely disregard Jung's experience, and they're saying like, well, he just didn't get it. He didn't have the understanding of the unconscious that could come about through this kind of LSD experience. In a way, I think there was maybe a bit of a misunderstanding, or obviously the Red Book wasn't known at the time. Jung didn't want to have anything to do with psychedelics, so these two worlds never really met there. And but they could have also taken something of this Jung's more cautionary approach to actually understand what he meant by saying that the ego can suffer from this theosophical inflation. So here's another quotation in which Jung basically warns against this literal interpretation of these experiences. So he writes, "The inflation has nothing to do with the kind of knowledge, but simply and solely with the fact that any new knowledge can so seize hold of a weak head that he no longer sees and hears anything else. He is hypnotized by it and instantly believes he has solved the riddle of the universe, but that is equivalent to almighty self-conceit." So Jung argued basically that in order to be in the experience, the ego function needed to be very strong, not like that, maybe the ego didn't need to be lost, but actually it was something that needed to be retained in such a powerful experience. And here I'm also reminded by this quotation by James Hillman, who says that we are lived by the powers we do not understand. And by this he means that there are always these operating forces, and I think Jung also understood this when he was delving into these worlds of spirits. And he did feel haunted also at times, and there's he writes it in his autobiography, Memories and Dreams and Reflections, that, for instance, he would have spirits come to his house and knock over stuff, and the whole family would be really scared and all that. So he did have these very bizarre experiences that couldn't really be explained, also as a result of dabbling with the world of the unconscious. But so in this essay, Transcendent Function, Jung essentially he identifies these two ways in which the ego can suffer from the encounter with the unconscious, and one of them being, that the ego is too weak when it encounters this divinity and then it becomes depressed. And then the second one being related to Adler's notion of godlikeness, in which the individual ego mistakes themselves with this divine experience. So, I mean, yeah, I think basically Jung was back in the days talking about something that we now know as integration, but back then nobody would have really understood what he was actually talking about, that there needed to be a certain kind of moral development that went hand in hand with these intense experiences, that not just anybody could kind of go into these ecstatic experiences. And one of the things that he says about LSD or mescaline, I don't remember which one it was that he would never want to take it because he wouldn't want to just like go into this splendor of divinity, without announcing himself or something. He just had too much respect for it, essentially. And also he says that, like when he goes into these spaces, basically the archetypes can become activated, and then they can also flood the individual consciousness and then create more synchronicities. And this can be all very confusing for the individual. So, yeah, I think he also, like, one of the reasons why he was arguing so adamantly against the well, also, he wrote some cautionary stuff also about meditation and just about, Westerners engaging with Eastern wisdom and all that, was because he felt that the Western consciousness was actually like a really recent invention, and that it hadn't developed almost at all, that it was the Western consciousness that was very infantile, because it had this complete split. It had no knowledge of the other kind of realm besides its own sort of a high horse rationality, and that the intellect was basically completely dominating nature. So just trying to find out where I am. So basically, Jung believed that this goal of personhood was essentially just to establish wholeness of the psyche, which he believed as being the self, and that for this to happen, this certain degree of a collaboration with the unconscious was important, but that it was, rather than there being this sort of bursts of experiences, it was this long and gradual journey. And it required also sacrifices from the part of the individual, and therefore these dreams and intuitions were something that was the most stable and solid way of interacting with it. However, it's very interesting because, having now mentioned so many times that Jung did not endorse psychedelics, there's this one particular story from this analytical psychologist called Michael Fordham, and I'm just going to read it because it's quite interesting, because there's nothing else in existence that I know of that could have indicated that Jung actually had some positive ideas about psychedelics. So this is Fordham seeing Jung just days before his death. He was ill when I arrived, but Miss Bailey told me to come out to Seestrasse. It would do him good to see you, she said. Encouraged, I arrived, and Jung was there in his dressing gown and a skull cap. I told him about the letter and delivered my message. He looked at me as though I were a poor fool and did not know a thing. Then he started to talk about LSD and the abassement du niveau mental, I'm sorry, I don't speak French, that it produced so that the archetypes could come into the field of consciousness. I had heard this dissertation more than once, and it had always been a bad sign. This time he looked quite different from the usual Jung, and even when he had been ill, and I got the impression that he was dying. He eventually became confused and distressed, and I asked him what was the matter. He did not speak for a minute or two, and then he said, "You had better go," and regretfully I did so. in a few days he was dead. So I think this reminded me of just also what Andy Letcher said, or was it Peter, about Suzuki becoming interested in LSD right before his death. And this seems that similar scenario was true to Jung. Michael Fordham is quite straight edge. He's not interested in psychedelics. So obviously he thought that Jung was just, losing his marbles, but maybe there was some kind of insight or moments of clarity there when he was considering what these substances could actually do, as he also was very aware that we were progressing towards this more technological and extroverted and rational kind of culture, and that there was less and less space for this introspective spirituality, which he endorsed and encouraged people to do. So maybe he started to think that, okay, maybe there could be these nudges or prompts that could be used that could be very helpful for people to better understand these states. But since we don't have anything from Jung himself, we actually cannot say that this is what happened. But this particular account is quite interesting in a sense that it actually shows that he may have reconsidered his stance a little bit. So this whole notion of the Red Book is quite confusing in itself, because it's like, well, what was he trying to do, and what can we do with this Red Book now? It's also interesting that many people who are interested in psychedelics are very interested in the Red Book. So there's some kind of parallel there, that people find that there is this pull towards this, and obviously the visual imagery also, it has a certain resemblance to psychedelic states as well. And I think having sort of contemplated this a little bit, and I think that essentially the Red Book, for me, the way in which I understand it is like, it's just a really successful process of integration of a really long and elaborate trip, because Jung actually brought forward something really beautiful, and he, using all of his knowledge and wisdom and understanding, and also artistic capacity, he managed to create something long lasting and add it to his legacy. And I think it's a bit of a shame that he did not publish it in his lifetime, because I think it could have really influenced so many things. But Jung himself, for instance, in one of the parts of the Red Book, he's speaking with the soul, and he's asking the soul, like, so what is this that I'm doing? Like, what is this experimentation that is happening now? And then the soul says to him, like, this is art. And Jung is really displeased with this answer, because he did not want to be an artist. He was not interested in doing that. He was a scientist, so this was something that he considered to be of inferior value. But then at the same time, I think it's curious that even somebody like Jung, this enormous intellect who, produced this vast body of work, wanted to become a creator in himself. Like he actually had this urge to make something out of these experiences that was so relying on this intuitive, irrational function, instead of trying to just break it down to bits and make some kind of coherent sense out of it. So I think in that sense, this creativity just links with his creativity. And I also like this fact that, for instance, in one of these quotes, Jung talks about nature as an incomparable guide and makes this parallel. And I have this book also here, which is quite nice, called The Earth Has a Soul. And this is like Jung on nature, technology, and modern life. And it speaks about how Jung was really actually constantly trying to escape this more and more technological civilization. And he built his own tower, and he would go on these retreats, and he would just be there, chopping wood and carrying water and living very aesthetically. Yes, this Because he felt that this was required for this introspective spirituality to grow, and for his psyche and for his connection with his own soul. And in that sense, actually, this book also has some pretty interesting quotes. Maybe I will read one more quotation regarding Jung and his connection with nature, which almost point him towards animism. So here he, for instance, says, "At times I feel as if I'm spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the splashing of the waves, in the clouds and the animals that come and go, in the procession of the seasons. There's nothing in the tower that has not grown into its own form over the decades, nothing with which I am not linked. Here everything has its history, and mine, here is a space for the spaceless kingdom of the worlds and the psyche's hinterland." As this is the final note, I think what prevails to be one of the most key takes from Jungian psychology, and also an interesting aspect to consider when it comes to psychedelics and considering how to work with these states and how to integrate and incorporate them, is the relevance of symbols, and also just the relevance of this religious and mythological imagination that we have in understanding these imaginal spaces. So yeah, I think I will just leave it at that, actually. Sorry?
Stop share.
Stop.
You can actually see the
Oh, how do I do that?
stop share.
The little red button.
Oh, this, yeah.
Yeah, that would have been it. And now where's our Zoom?
Oh, okay. How do we get this on every screen? I don't know. Hey, Joseph, do you know how to get this on every screen?
You can go ahead. Shouldn't take too long.
We want to see everyone.
It's Meredith Sabini. Sabini, I write down.
We still have a question.
Oh, okay. Am I taking guest questions? Yeah, okay.
Right.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, no. Okay, Jamie. Go for it.
Do you think there were times in Jung's life when he would have met the modern day criteria for psychosis?
Yeah, probably. But he felt that it was knowledge, that, and this is also something that he writes about in Ion, for instance, that this is what the ancient Gnostics and alchemists understood, that psyche can act as a source of knowledge. So he basically felt that it was maybe sometimes a little bit too much knowledge about just how, what was the direction of this new psychology and what was his role in our culture's history and all that. It would have probably considered to be like a megalomaniac psychotic episode by many people, but maybe parts of it were also true. So I don't know. It's hard to say. Yes.
And the reason that he never published it possibly be that he felt publishing this would actually be a coming out as a psychotic and therefore completely undermine his legacy.
This is where I was going.
Yeah, I think so. I think that was probably one of the primary reasons why he didn't publish it.
Speaking of your personal belief, think, so you said you had dreams, so you're fire or blood or something, which is foreshadowing the effect of water. Do you think any of that was present, or do you think you just reading the room, Europe is a very tumultuous place at the time, he was a psychiatrist, very intelligent?
Well, yes, it's a good question, and I think it's, I don't know. You're asking my personal belief. Well, I don't know. Like Jung he's a very elusive writer, and also his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. It's very much, he builds his own narrative. So it is him also analyzed through the lens of him, and therefore it's very hard to say these are his internal experiences. But I don't think there's, like, I do think precognitive dreams can take place. So I don't see there being too much of a conflict there. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is more like a comment / question, maybe something to discuss. There's these kind of diagnosis of the modern world that is this cage of rationality, and in that room is not alone, right? We have Weber, Simmel, all the social theorists have this idea that modernity is what is kind of like oppressing the individual, right? And I see that narrative in Jung. I always found that a little bit naive, in the sense that even with this rationality, you are not lost. That kind of primal experience, that spirituality is not lost, but some sort of like rechanneling is happening, right? And whenever I hear about Freud and Jung and this idea of the self, how it's constructed, and these kind of primal desires, I always think that there's something there to unpack a little bit in terms of social theory. For instance, I think there's a little bit of a naive construction of the self and society being just a repressive envelope from some primal forces. What about that? I mean, for me, it's uncomfortable, I have to confess.
So I mean, you mean that the idea of it is too narrow, like, or do you feel that there, these men feeling confined in their rationality, that there's something not justified about it, or?
Yes, that's one that is too narrow. One, it makes modernity exceptional, right? This rationality is different from the others, which in a way I understand, right? The law, the regulations, the way in which the world is organized, and the space for spirituality is very marginal, which I think Jung is doing, but I'm not entirely comfortable with the idea that this is something that is really left out of the modern world.
Well, I mean, I think it's just if you think about it from the early 20th century, and it's obviously Germany was like slightly different from the UK, for instance, like not being such a colonial power, but still, I think there was very much this like a gang of men writing about their particular experiences from their particular environments, and trying to analyze and comprehend everything else that was going on through that lens. And I think that was the sort of the conflicting element that Jung was also feeling. I mean, he could see himself as being also very much in this particular position, and he visited Native Americans, in United States, in America, or whatever it is, and he also went to Africa, and he sort of observed all these tribal people and was trying to understand what was going on there. But I think he never just really escaped this particular cultural climate of sort of sense of superiority, and trying to just fit everything into these confines. Like maybe he also recognized that in himself a little bit as well, that he just like was never really able to actually participate in it, because he was just too stuck with his own cultural conditioning.
Sorry, just to go back to the question about psychosis. Do you think that he was drawing a distinction between the psychosis of somebody who was not properly integrating these materials from the unconscious, and I think in one of the early quotes you mentioned a kind of madness, which almost had like a positive connotation to it, maybe like the madness of a wise fool or something, where he was accessing use images through a madness,
Mhm.
speaking of positively, but then also warning against the dangers of psychosis. So
Yeah.
What is the difference between those two things, I guess?
Well, I think they really run parallel with, it's both and, because it was something that terrified him because of this particular feeling of, he felt that he was gaining knowledge that was almost too much for his psyche to understand, and maybe struggling with this idea of like megalomania and all that. And I mean, because he had this idea of this future psychology, which was basically had all of these parts integrated. He later worked with somebody like Wolfgang Pauli to actually try to create some kind of framework for a theory of synchronicity. So he realized that there was a certain kind of logic and structure to the way in which the unconscious operated, but that also without this particular approach, it could be really dangerous. And I mean, maybe it was a little bit dangerous for himself also at the beginning, but he also recognized it as something that you had to go through. And I mean, this is also something that I think many people who have done psychedelics or have heard other people's experiences about it, that it's definitely not just like a pleasant or unpleasant experience. Rather, it's everything, and then you draw something out of it. But in that sense, like our definitions of what is psychosis or what is madness, they don't really even apply. It kind of exists outside of it. I don't know if that.
Thank you.
I've talked just that's kind of follow up on someone who wants to go for it. The alternative psychiatry movement, right? So when you have that quote of opening arms, like thinking about accepting madness, right? There's this, I don't know if you know about these connections, maybe something that is completely out of context, but it seems to me that that's kind of like a little bit of a seed for this alternative psychiatry, that instead of trying to medicate, madness, wanted to kind of live with that, right? And all that kind of alternative approach to thinking about schizophrenia, for instance.
I think Jung's thinking would be pretty much in line with this. There's this documentary maker called Phil Borges. He writes about this crazy wise thing, made like documentaries about people who are, basically there's that notion that, okay, if a person is crazy in our society, would they maybe be having a shamanic initiation in some different society, and it's hard to say. It really is. But I think what Jung went through is definitely more like a shamanic kind of initiation. And but he had the framework to cultivate it, because in a way he's also a shaman, he's his doctor. So he was providing this for his community as well. I think I got a little bit sidetracked from what you were saying there.
Yeah, the affinity between those ideas of embracing madness and alternative psychiatry, it seems to me that there's a lot of affinity in the.
I think so.
Anti-psychiatry.
Yes, it's anti-psychiatry, of course, because medication is not part of the, I would say, alternative in the sense of not to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think somebody like Robert Lang, for instance, was hugely influenced by Jung.
Stuff go horribly wrong.
It did. Didn't go so well.
But at the end, right, there was a period of success. There was, I mean, the toll on them was huge. There was a period which was kind of enlightening and a great.
Yeah, and I mean, what's the measure of success and failure? Like if they were able to provide for some schizophrenic or psychotic patients some kind of feeling that maybe their experience, what they were having, had some kind of deeper meaning, and that they were not just sick and essentially to be cured from whatever they were experiencing, but that they maybe actually had something special about them, or that they were actually able to serve their community with these kinds of experiences. Maybe Lang had some successes in that, but I mean, he was just living with like a bunch of schizophrenics and his whole family in the house, so, and having sex with a number of them, so like it maybe just didn't go well for that reason.
Could I ask about the way
in which he actually lived during that phase, because he wasn't only privileged in terms of being an academic, but also by having a rich one. With sort of, so what was the one thing is to talk about these visions, but of course the problem with psychosis is so often that people become entirely dysfunctional in their everyday life. So the one thing is that people have visions. The other thing is what actually is a state of illness that drives people to go and see a psychiatrist or other people to send them into somewhere where they will be looked after because they seem to be doing so much harm to themselves and others. So what was the actual context in which he could afford to live more as a mystic or a shaman rather than being like a patient himself?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and I actually wanted to mention that during my presentation. So thanks for bringing that up. He was living just as regularly as he had his private practice. He moved to live like near Lakeside and dropped his position at Berkholsey Hospital at 1909. And him and his wife, they just had this nice setup somewhere near Lakeside, Zurich, and Jung was running his private practice all day, and then at nights he was engaging with this process. So he remained a very functional member of his family and continued to treat patients throughout it. There wasn't any period where he was just completely dysfunctional. So maybe that is also kind of answers the question. It's like he, if a person can navigate it, then
That's too as well. So, as you said, if he had been penniless, I'm sure he would have been in a different place.
yeah, lucky him. It just wasn't. He came from a relatively poor background, so it was well, not poor, but it wasn't necessarily very privileged.
Well, he had the affluence in his adult life to be considered an intellectual shaman, as opposed to maybe.
Yep. I mean, a large part of it was also because he married this woman called Emma Rauschenbach, who was, I guess one of this sort of, from this very privileged, wealthy family in Switzerland. So he just managed to dive into that lifestyle. So.
I mean, shamans are not particularly privileged.
But no,
I
I mean, it
most
doesn't.
of the shamans are not really privileged.
Yeah, I mean,
I think there's this connotation that being a shaman is some sort
I
of.
think shaman is really the wrong word. I
Yes.
think mystic is much better.
Yeah,
And it would fit also much closer with this very religious upbringing and the iconographic images he has been drawing. I mean, when you look at that, that is so much influenced by sort of religious symbolism of the Christian church that I actually would refuse to use the word shaman.
Well, okay. I mean,
it seems much more suitable. But if somebody is so, say, so porous, I think that could explain his resistance to actually trying drugs. Because if you are so porous without them, that is actually, I can imagine that he would see that as extremely risky, trying mescaline or LSD, because he has this anyway. So.
That can explain his compulsion towards it at the end of his life, because he thinks, well, I'm at the end. So, and then this could be this desire that's, well, I want to see what there is to offer before I go. Right?
There's more.
Yeah.
But that's also the kind of the destiny of shamans in Latin America that have become Christianized. They have forgotten or avoided, rejected anything that has to do with psychedelics or any substances. So I think it's also, that's why being a shaman, I don't know if that's the one, right? It's more like a mystic because there's this Puritan narrative around the substances, right? It's not like he had a bad trip and then he decided that this was crap. It was actually a stand before the experience, which is pretty, I read it as more a kind of Protestant Christian sort of approach.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it had to do with that, to be honest, because he didn't have a problem from deviating from Christianity. And I mean, if you read some of his late, he has also been declared as a heretic, I think, by the Catholic Church on a number of occasions by many people, so he's not actually accepted as a member of the Christian community, really, because it's just too unhinged for many people. So I mean, I don't know if it had to do with that. I think what Christine was saying about him already feeling more porous, I think maybe that's a better way of looking at it. And I mean, if you think about it also just at the time, you know, before technology and the kind of solitude and privacy there was for, you know, doing this kind of introspection, like actually just complete abandonment to one's own mind or whatnot. So I think that was just one of the last moments in history when this was still possible like that. So I don't really, yeah, I don't know what to say to that, but I don't think it necessarily had to do with the Christian thing. Yeah.
Two questions. First one, very practical. Can you get a copy of the Red Book with the illustration?
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a nice copy too.
The second question, you've got William James around the same sort of time period doing a lot of sort of transmission theory and the white radiance of the universe and consciousness being sort of filtered by the brain. Were Jung and, I know nothing about it, so were Jung and James ever in correspondence? Was Jung influenced by James at all? Because some stuff there seemed to sort of lend itself to a James interpretation.
Yeah, I think I've read maybe somebody write about this, that it's kind of weird that they didn't have any kind of correspondence, but I think back in the day still the UK and Germany were still such separate zones that I think it just maybe, I don't know, maybe they knew about one another, but maybe there wasn't correspondence necessarily. So I have to say that I don't know of any correspondence.
Weird though, because through the parapsychology, through the Society for Psychical Research,
yeah,
you've got William James as an American president, you've got, you know, people from Germany, got the whole lot together, so sharing through this forum through it all. So it seems like there was plenty of chatter between the UK and abroad as well through those sorts of parapsychology forums.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that it's strange that there wouldn't be in existence. I will look into this and see if I can find anything, but I sort of have this vague memory of having read a paper once that was sort of analyzing why there wasn't any correspondence between them. But yeah, Jung was definitely interested in parapsychology, and he was, you know, really vouching for R.B. Rhine, you know, who was doing all these parapsychological experiments, for instance. But maybe, I don't know, he had an enormous amount of correspondence with so many people. So maybe he just literally didn't have capacity to talk with James as well.
Just one of your quotes could have been lifted straight from William James. It's sort of
Right.
Jamesian and it's his tone. Interesting.
Yeah, going back to, you had on a slide about the surrender to madness, as well as there was a bubble about serving the paradoxical.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a bit more about that and what you think the function of that was?
Okay, well, great question, thank you. So Jung has this one notion called coincidentia oppositorum, which essentially means the conjunction of the opposites. And this is also something that he developed through his work in alchemy, because he figured that there was something about polarities that actually pulled together. And I think that was what he was starting to uncover during these Red Book years, that the chaos and the order coexisted very near besides one another. And also one quote that I saw from him today that kind of fits this situation pretty well is that we don't, you know, the mind doesn't go back and forth between right or wrong, it's between sense and nonsense. So it's like some of the Red Book, probably when you look at it, you're just like, wow, this is just like absurd, like this has no meaning to it. But then there are these like bits where maybe there is more meaning intertwined than it seems at first glance.
So do you think that he used contrast and that, like shadow and light, like all these antithetical concepts, as a way of balancing himself as well, if he was dealing with that psychosis threshold, I guess? He had that balancing function. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think so, because the a third part of the book is called Scrutinies. And in this, Jung basically goes on to completely devalue himself. It's like pages and pages of him telling himself what a worthless piece of, he is. And it's, like you wouldn't want to talk to yourself in that manner. But basically, there was also, that was like a contrast to him sort of feeling this, like that he was this megalomaniac lion god, or like the Christ consciousness and all that, So I think there is definitely a lot to what you just said about himself, him balancing himself out through these contrasts. And also, probably a lot of you have heard about the notion of the shadow, which is also something that is very popular now in the psychedelic circles, as everybody's busy doing their shadow work. This notion about there being this hidden side of human personality that we have to essentially come to terms with. So to recognize the innermost evil in ourselves in order to actually become fully compassionate and loving beings to others.
Do you think we can use that to understand spiritual bypassing experiences that people are saying with psychedelic experiences that you think you're not connected with that dark side or not emotional?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit wishy-washy, because it's hard to speak about it in terms that are actually practical. Like, I mean, I don't even really know what this shadow works really looks like. Besides, well,
I think there's a distinction between the dark side and shadow. I think when you said shadow, man, it was like everything is not available to the consciousness, good and bad. I don't know. I think.
Yeah. So it's like one part is just hidden, and then the other part is the actually sort of the evil of or the darkness of the world. Yeah. Well, I mean, what's interesting also in the Red Book is that there's this whole descent into hell, and Jung basically goes into the underworld, and this is obviously very mythological motif that's also present in Dante and in Swedenborg as well, that by going into these underworldly and depths and encountering a lot of like suffering and evil, then one comes out to the other side and has discovered something that is actually for the benefit of themselves or for the community.
Just, it seems to me that, of course, he's influenced by Western Esotericism a lot, like Blake theosophy, that sort of like, Western esoteric tradition, and lots of contemporary esoteric traditions cite Jung to talk about the synchronicity and so on. What do you think is he borrowing from that whole esoteric world? And what?
Actually, Jung was really not happy about being associated with the Theosophists, because he felt that if you know a little bit about the Theosophical Society and how they sort of organize themselves around these masters, and it's far more speculative than what Jung was doing. I mean, I think especially in the beginning of still writing the Red Book, Jung was very much on the idea of that, no, I'm an empiricist and I'm a scientist doing exploration of the unconscious. Well, yes, I don't exclude that, but yeah, he himself would have not wanted to be associated with the Theosophical Society. And I don't, because there was for him, there was too much, speculation.
You mentioned that if his work had been released during his lifetime, you think this would have had a profound impact on psychology. In my opinion, I think the migration towards behaviorism and social cognitive theories in psychology were really quite avoidable based on what was happening in the world and the shift towards sort of Americanism and how psychology migrated over from Europe to America after the war. How do you think this would have changed that?
Well, I mean, I cannot really say how I think it would have influenced these larger currents in psychology, because I mean, I think what's more likely is probably in line with what Christine was saying earlier, is that it maybe would have made Jung even a little bit more unhinged than he was already and is considered now, you know, because still, I mean, there's a reason why Jung is not, you know, spoken about in the psychology faculties these days, you know. so
Sorry, so do you think the release of that volume in his life would have meant that maybe this would have become a core textbook of the study of psychology?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. I think maybe, you know, there's kind of two ways it could go. That it would have maybe helped to actually explain Jung's theory better. Maybe it would have drawn more interest. But I think it probably would have led to even like more widespread adoption of Jung on a cultural level, because Jung is already just, you know, amazingly popular in this like art culture. So I think that's probably more of the like what it would have been even more culturally widely adopted, but I don't know if it would have really enhanced its psychological legitimacy.
Thank you.
Maybe.
I had a question about something you mentioned about the role of the ego, because you said that Jung was influenced by Gnosticism, and I guess they have in common with some of the Eastern philosophies that you were referencing. That, I mean, I guess the ego is ultimately sort of an illusion to be overcome, and you lose yourself in the oneness and all that. But it sounds like the individual ego is very real and very important. And I was wondering how he developed that idea and how he reconciled it with whatever he was driving from Gnosticism.
It's a very good question. I wonder if I can actually respond to this, but I think so one of the primary ideas that Jung took from the Gnostics is the idea of projection. So that, you know, there's the person essentially views the world as they are, and this is something that, you know, he was also trying to overcome, and that ties into this whole shadow aspect of it as well, because what you're essentially trying to, or what the Gnostics were trying to do, was to try to shatter that illusion of projection and to see, you know, enter this realm that was not dominated by this deity Abraxas, but rather by this supreme God. So I think I'm not sure. I don't think I know enough about the sort of his idea of his devil, how the ego function came about. I think that it was quite established already because of his work with Freud as well. And so it was probably pretty solid, and I'm not sure how it actually ties into the Gnostics. Oh, okay. Sure. I'm just gonna. How do I unmute people?
I have to unmute. All right. Can I ask you something? Yes. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. You mentioned at some point something about inflation. I don't know whether it was Jung talking about inflation or was somebody commenting on Jung about inflation, you know, because one of the things that very often happens with psychedelic experiences is that somehow you get stuck into some kind of revelation, which seems like very obvious. You get stuck into that, and then you continue, you know, put the emphasis on that, and you become the porter of the idea, you know, and becomes stuck somehow in this, and this is what. So people say, you know, it's called inflation. You get this Christ idea that you have the answer for everything because you have this or that experience. I don't know if you mention something like that, the concept of inflation in Jung.
Yeah, I did mention it, and I think it's one of the more interesting bits about his writings about altered states of consciousness, and also something that is quite relevant for the psychedelic experience, as you just mentioned as well, that the individual gets stuck on the revelation level and there is no real integration. And yeah, so that's what he was referring to as the state of godlikeness, which is from Adler, when the individual ego basically confuses itself with the experience that it's going through, and then takes literally this idea that you know, they are this deity, or you know, they have some kind of divine powers, or that they're chosen one, which are also really common attributes of many psychoses, just feeling all of these things, and there's no groundedness to that kind of experience. So yeah, that was something that he mentioned. There was something else that I wanted to mention about it, but it's kind of left me now. It will probably come back.
You know, I just a little anecdote. Terence McKenna, you know, we met when we were in the early 20s, and I remember several times asking, what is the author who has influenced you most? And he said Jung. So very interesting that, you know, that Terence, you know, back in the 70s, you know, he was already talking about Jung and somehow associated with the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, I think I've heard him say also in some interviews that his long time dream was to become a Jungian analyst before he went down the path of becoming a psychedelic prophet, or I don't know what
he went down. Thank you. Went down too. Yeah. All right. Okay.
The chosen path. Yeah. No. I mean, I think Terence is one of these minds that really he understood a lot, and as well as Philip K. Dick, who also they had sort of affinity to one another. I'm not sure if they ever met, but they sort of lived in similar areas in California, and they both had this fascination with Jung and his idea of the collective unconscious and what it contributed to the cultural history. So yeah, I think Terence recognized that what Jung was bringing forward was not just some ideas that he had developed and, you know, some theories that he was putting forward from himself, but rather that they were these, you know, that he took a lot of his ideas from the Gnostics and from the alchemists, and that they were just being revived through Jung's work in our culture.
I would like to read provisionally, because I haven't actually read it now recently, but reading what you have been quoting and speaking about in Jung's Red Book and his experiences. If I read this through Freud's Fallschreiber, then it appear to me to be great similarities in terms of it's not Jesus, it's God, but there is also this 4 phases of full functionability in the professional context, and then dysfunction, not on a day and night difference, but over weeks or months, but where you have these sort of episodes of schizophrenia. But then Freud, of course, interprets as or speculates that one of the reasons for it is childhood abuse. And if I remember this right, if it's all just hearsay, then it seems that Jung had phases of sort of, say, erotic experimentation with sadomasochism, which seems to sort of pick up some of the elements that we might also see in the Fallschreiber. Now, I'm aware that Freud hasn't analyzed the Red Book phase of Jung, but I wonder to which degree Jung was maybe aware of this thinking. Of course, Freud wrote the Fallschreiber, I think, after the Red Book phase of Jung. But if we bring this together, then did Jung ever speculate in the psychoanalytic sense about forms of trauma that may have caused him to be, say, so porous towards experiences that he then had enormous work to do to integrate, because he could push them aside or rationalize them. But of course, the whole struggle was that he was trying to rationalize them and couldn't. So what do you think about that?
It's a good question, and honestly, it's also something that I've considered, but not maybe in as much depth as I should have, because I think my short answer is like no, because it's if you go to Jungian communities, you will find that Jung and what he says is not being questioned very much. So it's not that people are sitting around and speculating about his traumas. That's not really something that happens a lot. So but yeah, I mean, I think it was quite clear from since Jung was, I mean, at least this is, again, his autobiography, his own experiences, but who else can tell your childhood experience but yourself, besides maybe parents or family, but that he was quite a special child, and I don't think there was any trauma necessarily. I think he wasn't the only child, so he spent a lot of time alone, and he was surrounded mainly by adults, so he didn't really have playmates and stuff like that, which sort of led into this be quite a mature kid since a young age. And then the little bits that he mentions about his childhood was that he didn't really get on with children because he had such an assertive, dominant character, and then and then that's what kind of came about later on. So I don't know what's the role of trauma, but I think maybe here is like one thing to mention that I find quite interesting about Jungian psychology, and maybe a little bit lacking as well, that it's not terribly embodied, and also there is not that much talk about sexuality. So I mean, Jung did write a book about the Kundalini, so in that he goes a little bit to the body, and I think he was talking about some particular exercises that he was doing himself, but it's not something that goes really to the somatic parts of the human experience.
You had a quotation, I think it was something like that you need to follow the river and not take it literally, otherwise you will get stuck. And it reminded me, I think it's a Joseph Campbell quotation. Anyway, that's like the psychotic drowns in same rivers that the mystic streams.
Yeah.
I don't even know if it's rivers now, or if
yeah, I know this one though.
Yeah. So I think somehow linking it with the concept of death, is that something that I'm not sure what role death plays in Jung's mind, and does he see the physical world as the surface and the depth going towards the soul and being able to navigate that? Or
so what do you mean physical in what sense? Like physical world as surface of what? Or
so what is the concept of depth in Jungian?
Well, I think it's also it's known later on as depth psychology, so I think it's very relevant, and I think it's just because when it comes to these dreams, so as I was just reading from this book that Jung essentially he equated dreams as sort of pure phenomena of nature, and that when human beings were analyzing and dissecting the dreams, we were able to bring back something that was of value, but that there was this like mutual dependency. And I guess it's as you can imagine with something like dream work, where when a person doesn't really record their dreams, they're not interested in them, there is not that kind of depth. And then more you start to work with it, or if you work with some other types of altered states of consciousness, the more layers you go through, and then there is this sort of individual consciousness, which at some point is I don't think it's like a breaking point. I think they're very much entangled, that the person can then also have these experiences which are more of collective nature rather than just of the individual's personal unconscious. And that is what is essentially meant by the depth. And for Jung in particular, it was then sort of having certain understanding of like where this Western culture was regarding its psychology and the direction into which we were going, which he was quite disenchanted by.
So it's not like that just the individual can dive into the depth, it can be a shared experience as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's, well, Jungian psychology is quite individualistic, but Jung does talk about the importance of community and having other people to share these experiences with. So it's not as, maybe not as individualized as it would be, but he doesn't really endorse these, you know, group settings that much, you know, like his main tool of it was working with it was individualized.
5. Would you want to ask the online audience whether there are more questions?
Yeah, you just put up your little hand sign if anybody has any questions online. There's nobody else, unless Luis, do you want to ask something else? Actually, maybe I can say.
No, it's okay. I'm fine. Thank you. Very good.
Maybe I can answer to this question, Luis, that you had before, because now that thing came back to me that I wanted to say before about the inflation and about the dangers of the literal interpretation. So Jung also wrote about Nietzsche, for instance, who, you know, Nietzsche had this experience of going crazy. And that was also actually related to him experiencing himself as a messiah. And Jung also had this experience of seeing himself as a messiah. But the difference, as Jung argued himself, was that he was able to see that it was just a symbolic representation, and therefore his psyche wasn't inflated by it, because he was just seeing that this is the archetype of the universal Christ consciousness that he got to experience, and that's it. Whereas for somebody who didn't have that symbolic tool, they then were basically kind of lost in that river, and that's yeah, what he mentioned about Nietzsche also going derailed with it.
Yeah. How many dreams did you say he?
According to this source, which I cannot even tell you right now, it's 80,000.
Did he start with a sort of theory of dreams, like Freud's psychopathology of dreams, and then interpret it a certain way, or did his views on what he saw interpreting that many dreams change and develop?
Well, I mean, he what he was working with before, you know, he started this experimentation with the Red Book was, for instance, these word association tests. So he was always really interested in just seeing like what kind of unconscious mechanism led to another kind of unconscious mechanism. So maybe in that way, he already had quite a good, like a certain kind of framework for working with the dreams, of seeing particular symbols and then interpreting them. And I mean, that's what Jungian psychology is, like what a lot of you know, for instance, these recurring dream symbols, that's very important. So, you know, like if there's a dream of a house, it's the representation of the psyche. I don't think I can say much more about the actual like development of how he went on about it and how much it differed from Freud's, for instance. But yeah, I think the recurring symbols were something that he always found to be very important.
Did you have any lucid dreams?
I actually don't know this.
As if you would have been very into them.
Yeah, it's a good area of looking into, but I'm not sure of it.
So people who record have more dreams.
Well, if you record dreams, you're much more likely to become aware of the fact that you're dreaming during a dream. So you're much more lucid. So maybe he experienced this and this kind of played into his ideology.
Honestly, I don't think I've never really looked into this, but I will. Yeah.
From your stand.
Yep. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much.